Hello, welcome to Doors to Hope and Healing, an inside look at foster care and adoption needs in Connecticut. My name is Jacqueline Ford. I am humbled and honored to have worked for the Department of Children and Families for over 25 years, and although I may be familiar with many of the topics I bring to you, I am inviting experts in those fields to share their knowledge. Joining me in the studio is Tammy Sneed, a director from the Department of Children and Families. My colleague is an expert in the field topic of human trafficking. She will enlighten us about this statewide and national issue that is affecting our youth. Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Jackie.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Tell me how long you've been with DCF and what your role with the agency is.
Sure. I've been with the department for about 14 years, and my current role is I'm the Director of Gender Responsive Adolescent Services, which covers a whole host of programming for adolescent girls and boys. And I also oversee Connecticut's Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team. And we call that HART, H-A-R-T.
And what does HART stand for?
Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team.
Okay, so I understand that you haven't only worked in this field, you've also brought our issues and concerns home, and you've fostered children in our care. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. Quite a few years ago, probably a good 10 years ago, my husband and I decided to do some foster care and really enjoyed it. I had met some wonderful children through our years that we were certified. And in fact, 2 of the children that we fostered, we ended up adopting. And to this day are very connected to our family. They're young adults at this point and doing really well. So it's definitely a passion of mine to ensure kids are placed with families that will love and care for them long term.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. So you're invited to talk about human trafficking, and I understand that there is both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Can you tell our viewers about human trafficking and what exactly that is?
Sure. In general, when we're talking about human trafficking, we tend to divert back to our Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which really focuses on sex and labor trafficking for both adults and kids. Mm-hmm. When we are focused on child trafficking, there's some nuances to the definitions. So when we're talking about sex trafficking of children, we're talking about the exchange of any sex act for anything of value. So if a child is having sex for a place to sleep, for a meal, they are victims of trafficking, and in that case, sex trafficking. Labor trafficking, again, can be both adults and minors, as is sex trafficking. But with labor trafficking, we're looking for force, fraud, or coercion with our young people, and that typically involves kids that are working for many hours, typically are not going to school, often unhealthy working conditions. Sometimes they're trying to pay down a debt that the family owes, but both are equally devastating.
Mm-hmm. And is this a national crisis?
Absolutely. The numbers across the country, they're really difficult to get a solid number, but in general, we're looking at anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 kids as victims of sex trafficking every year. The reason it's so hard to get a number on it is, one, we as society often do not know these kids are victims of sex trafficking, and lots of times the kids do not know. Mm-hmm. They often blame themselves. They're being told that what they're doing is their fault and not the trafficker's fault. So it's very complicated to get real numbers around this, but we are slowly getting those numbers across the country and definitely in Connecticut.
And how does Connecticut compare to the national crisis?
Sure. People think little Connecticut, we don't have child sex trafficking, and we absolutely do. And every year we're seeing the numbers go up. And I contribute that to a couple of reasons. People will ask me, do you think it's increasing in Connecticut or across the country? And I do think it's increasing. Mm-hmm. And I think mostly it's increasing because of social media, and we can talk about that in a few minutes. But also, training and awareness tends to bring more referrals because people start to understand what sex trafficking is, and they'll call the department with kids that they think are victims. Hence, talking today hopefully will bring some knowledge out to the community, and we will identify some kids that we probably would not have identified prior.
How do you find children are being lured into being a victim of sex trafficking or human trafficking?
Sure. There's, when we look at the national framework, we're looking at force, fraud, or coercion, even though you don't have to prove that when you're talking about children under the age of 18. But we typically see the fraud piece, and that usually means a boyfriend, somebody that is taking the child out, buying them things, saying that they love the child, and eventually the reality is that they're a trafficker and this was all the grooming process comes out, but it's usually too late for the young person. We've seen false promises, we've seen modeling agencies, we've seen production companies, again, where kids who, they're naive, they're adolescents, they're naive, will think that they're joining this particular modeling company, and they're all excited about it because what adolescent girl doesn't want to be a model? And lo and behold, the persons behind this agency are traffickers, and before they know it, they're in sex trafficking.
Wow. And what are some of the red flags that our viewers can look for in their own children and children that they may be working with in the community?
Sure. There's a whole host of them. And I always tell people to be careful that it's not just one red flag. So if you see one of these, it doesn't mean absolutely this child is a victim of trafficking, but they're worth paying attention to. Some of them include kids that have things that do not have the means to purchase them, or the family doesn't have the means to purchase them. We've had kids coming back with new clothing, with new electronics, with new cell phones or multiple cell phones. Right? Kids nowadays typically all have cell phones. When they have more than one cell phone, that really should be a red flag. And some of the kids that are involved in the life even have more than 2 cell phones. So some of those kind of indicators are of concern.
And what's the purpose for the more than one cell phone?
Typically, their trafficker will give them a cell phone or a couple cell phones, and that's how they're communicating with the kids. Sometimes they will use their own, but often they're getting something very specific from their trafficker.
Okay.
The kids often will have an older boyfriend or an older adult in their life that they become very dependent on. They start to kind of evolve their life around. So when a young person ages 15 or 16 has a boyfriend that's age 28 or a girlfriend that's age 30, start to question it, what's going on. When there's injuries, sometimes kids will say, well, I got this, black eye because I got into a fight at school. It was no big deal. Principal dealt with it. It's okay. Or this scratch or this bang on my knees because I fell down. But when you start to see injuries that are not typical for that particular young person, they're not in sports, there's no real reason for those injuries, I'd start to question it. If you suspect that they're starting to use substances, lots of times the kids will self-medicate, and lots of times the trafficker will give them drugs to get them to comply. So there's a whole host of kind of red flags, and when you put them together, it often starts to ring that bell that maybe this is a possibility for this young person. The other issue is tattoos. So that's another thing very common for kids nowadays. But I tell folks, especially with girls, if you ask a girl what her tattoo means, she'll usually tell you, and it'll usually have some sort of meaning behind it. She'll say, well, the wings are because I lost my dad when he was, when I was 10 years old.
Right.
If they get defensive and don't want to talk about it, that's when I would start to have some concerns. And if you see particular groups of girls with the same tattoo, definitely a major concern.
So is it a branding or some type of initiation?
It is. It's absolutely branding. We've seen dollar signs branded on kids. We've seen barcodes branded on kids. Sometimes the trafficker will put the name on the child either in the back of the neck or across the chest. So some sort of branding that signifies that they belong to a particular trafficker.
Wow. And how, if you had touched upon social media, tell us more about that, what parents and guardians can be looking for, and even our foster families with these kids that they're caring for with regard to social media.
That is huge. So the vast majority of our kids are being groomed via the internet. We often think Facebook is not that common any longer for our young people, but we have found with most of our kids that's where they start to be groomed.
Oh, really?
And the traffickers are very slick, so they start to pay attention. Somehow they get onto social media, maybe by a peer or maybe by some kids in the community, but somehow they get on social media and they start to make connections with these kids. And some kids will ignore inquiries from people they don't know, and lots of people don't, especially if that person on the other end starts to share information that seems like they know that young person or know their community. We had one trafficker identify a teacher that he just graduated from high school, and he said, "Oh, I had such and such a teacher." And the kid was like, "Oh, I had that teacher as well," and started talking about the teacher. Well, lo and behold, the trafficker, he was much older, he went on the website. He knew what school the child went to. He went on the website, saw a list of the teachers, and picked out the oldest teacher that he was able to see. So he was pretty certain that that teacher's been around for a while. So they're very skilled at that.
To find that connection to that child, to bring them in.
Absolutely. And then they're watching. So, you and I have both raised kids. When our kids complain about us, my mom just doesn't get me, or I'm really, really just tired of this. Somebody on that other end is going to say, "I get what you mean. My mom does the same thing. Sometimes I just have to get out of here." But always looking for that way to get in touch with that young person, to kind of find that unique opportunity.
I see.
So we just talked about the recruitment piece online. The other piece of this is they're often sold online. So prior to Backpage being shut down, many of our kids were posted on Backpage. Backpage was shut down. The FBI seized it several months ago, early last year. And at this point, there are several new websites that have popped up replacing Backpage. So many times kids are being posted on websites and sold via websites, which makes this a very low-risk industry for the trafficker and very profitable industry for the trafficker.
And how is it that they're able to get away with having these children's pictures posted and their information posted on a website and not get caught?
Absolutely. So the challenge with Backpage, there's a whole history to what they were doing, but they actually had somebody helping edit some of the advertisements. So they were able to post even though it was a child. Some of these other websites, they're hosted in other countries, and some of the legalities around addressing those websites are much more complicated. So we're not always able to get to the website, and it is pretty easy for a trafficker to post them. Wow. Now, when they do post them, there's certain language they use that indicates the person they're posting is a child. They may not say this is a 12-year-old, but they can use some terms that I won't use on your show that will indicate to the buyer that this is a young person under a certain age.
So the buyer is the one who knows what that vocabulary is all about and what certain code words may mean.
Absolutely. The buyer and the traffickers. There's a language out there, and they call it the life. There's a language in the life that folks are using that allow people to purchase kids very deliberately.
And I know we talked about, what lures children in and what red flags to look for, but I've also heard that when a child is trafficked, she ends up developing a bond or a connection to her trafficker or his trafficker, and it's called trauma bonding. Can you talk with us more about trauma bonding?
Sure. So one of the biggest challenges to working with kids that have been pulled into child trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, is they become very committed to the trafficker. The trafficker will do their very best during a grooming phase to become kind of that one person in that child's life that means more to them than anything. And once that bond is solidified, it's really difficult to break. And I've talked to kids and I've heard so many different comments. One of the girls told me that her trafficker is the first person in her life to ever buy her cough medicine and soup when she was sick. So they replace something that child is missing or perceives that is missing, and then the child doesn't think they can live without it. It can go as deep, though, where kids start to fear for their own life. Sometimes there's lots of threats to their life as well as their family's life. We had one girl that her trafficker would tell her, if you don't do this, I'm going to go get your 8-year-old little sister, and I know you live at such and such street, and I know she gets off the bus at 3:50 p.m. So they have real information that scares the child also into complying. And then I had one young person, and this is very similar to the dynamics with domestic violence, but she would say, the reason he hits me is because I don't always do what I need to do, or I was rude to him, or I was disrespectful to him. So really, again, putting that blame on themselves and not on the trafficker, because that bond becomes so tight. We talk a lot about Stockholm Syndrome, and I'm sure lots of folks have heard about that as well. It's just that really tight bond between the trafficker and the child. That leads to a big challenge. When we do have kids in the life, very enmeshed in the life, it's tough to get them on the road to recovery. It is a process for them, and typically we see kids and adults in the life go back to the life about 7 times before they're finally out and moving forward on their own. So it's a big challenge for them. On a super positive note, when we get kids out of the life, when they're engaged in the right services, we are seeing kids graduate from high school, we're seeing kids get jobs, we're seeing kids go to college. So we're seeing successes, but it's not before our worker or the foster family or the police officer has to open up their arms several times to take them back after they again go back with the trafficker.
Wow, it's so interesting to hear everything that you're talking about. Now, I think the assumption is that the children that are trafficked are foster kids, or kids that may be homeless, or aren't coming from a real stable, loving family. Is that a true assumption, or is that a fallacy?
It's false. So, and actually, because I've done foster care and adoption, it gets me a little riled up when I hear across the country that the victims are kids in foster care. And it even goes on when you listen to some folks talk across the country where the focus is on the foster parent as the trafficker. In Connecticut, rarely happens where we have a foster parent that's implicit in any way in trafficking children. And that really holds true across the country. There have been some horrible cases where foster parents have been traffickers, but it's not the norm. The majority of these kids are kids that have experienced abuse and neglect prior to their trafficking scenario. Many times they have sexual abuse, physical abuse, and so forth. So I would be more comfortable if we talked nationally about kids that are high risk because of abuse and neglect versus kids that are in foster care. But I think it all gets wrapped up in kind of one bundle. But in Connecticut, we have seen a very small number of kids in foster care be victims, but we have seen some. Not by the foster parents. Most of our kids, though, which is really important, are living at home at the time of their victimization. In 2017, well over 60% of our kids that were identified were living at home with a parent or guardian while being victimized. And it doesn't mean that the parent, guardian, or entrusted caregiver was the actual perpetrator. Could be. We've had a couple of those cases. But most of the cases, that's not the case. They could have had histories of abuse and neglect. They could have touched our department, but they are actually living at home. So, and the reason I'm stressing this is because if we're not educating these kids in school, we are missing a really important opportunity to stop trafficking where it starts.
And I know we talked about this before, but sometimes the trafficking is happening right in the school with the upper level grades in trying to entice maybe the freshman students coming in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, trafficking, and kids don't call it trafficking, particularly kids in school that haven't been educated, has become normalized. And we no longer even use the word pimp when we're talking about kids in trafficking because it tends to idolize the life, and we don't want that to happen. But more often than not, kids are not looking at this as a crime, or they're looking at it, the kids that are victims are looking at it as something they are doing wrong and not what's being done to them. So there is quite a bit of recruitment happening in schools. There's quite a bit of recruitment happening after school. We had a case, you know, we're talking about all the high-risk kids, but we had a case where we had a two-parent family. Nice part of the state. This kid was a straight A student, little brother she got along with. No issues, all right? We never met this kid, DCF never entered that home, and this kid entered high school. And her first year in high school, within the first couple of months, her grades plummeted. I mean, she went from straight A's to failing. The good news was the family was worried, and they went and did some searching in her room, and they found a journal, and she had a list of all the buyers she was sleeping with.
Wow.
And what we found out is that when she went to her first high school party, I think it was like late September, early October, she met a group of juniors and seniors, and they said, this is what we do. If you want to be part of this, you need to do it too. So just that peer pressure, bullying, so some of those things, you can't talk enough about bullying, but just that bullying and that peer pressure in high school puts kids at such high risk. And then you add risk factors of previous abuse and neglect, the numbers skyrocket.
Wow. And you had mentioned back in our conversation today about foster parents. Do we offer at our department any training around preparing foster families to take in a youth that we may be taking right from this horrible crisis situation?
Sure, absolutely. I would strongly recommend any foster parent, actually any parent, but any foster parent as well, be trained on trafficking. And we have an introduction to child trafficking training, which is 2 hours that we offer across the state. There's no charge for it, and it's strongly recommended. But we have taken it a step further. We have a 3-day training for foster parents that want to deliberately work with these kids. Some foster parents are working with these kids that we don't know they're victims of trafficking, the parent doesn't know they're a victim of trafficking, and one of us at some point will probably identify it. But we have kids where we know they need a stable family environment, and they will work with that child through all those ups and downs, those 7 times, to get that young person stable and out of the life. And it's an excellent training, and foster parents that have gone through it love it.
Because it really prepares them.
It does, it does.
And we also have curriculum that we're training staff with too, so that they know what to look for when they're in the homes and involved with these families.
Absolutely. We are training all of our staff, all of our programs, all of our services, and trying desperately to educate the communities around the state of Connecticut.
Well, before we end today, if one of our viewers is watching and something they heard today is making them uncomfortable or suspicious that they have a child or may know of a child that's being trafficked, what should they do? Who should they call?
Absolutely call our DCF care line. That is so extremely important. It does fall under mandated reporting, so if you're a mandated reporter, you're required to call it in. But even if you're not, if you think you know a child, boy or girl, because boys are victims as well, please call our care line. Those referrals immediately go to our human anti-trafficking response team, and we ensure that child gets services. We coordinate with law enforcement to make sure that child is safe and to hopefully get that trafficker and or the buyers off the street.
Wow, you've shared so much valuable information. I know I've learned so much. So we're going to be showing our viewers some support. We didn't have a chance to talk about Love 146, but they do provide support to the victims and awareness and education in the community.
They're wonderful. They're our #1 provider in the state of Connecticut.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on with us on Doors to Hope and Healing, and we'll have you back again.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
We learned so much from Tammy about the realities of human trafficking, the signs, the effects on a child's mental and physical health, and we also learned about the work that's being done in Connecticut to help change this harsh reality of human trafficking. Please take a moment to watch a short video that was shared with us, courtesy of Love 146. Thank you.
Just by working with our company, it's a 20% increase within the next 5 years. in the next 5 years. It's a win-win situation for everyone.
To the untrained eye, it's almost never obvious, but it is happening around you. And every child is vulnerable, even yours. Even me. Make it okay for me to have a conversation with you. Really try to hear what I'm saying. Tell me that nothing I say will make you love me less. Don't assume I already know that. And realize it might take some time for me to believe it. Learn about my relationships. Who am I hanging out with? Who am I talking to online? Who do I have a crush on? I want you to care. And help me tell the difference between what's fun and what's sketchy. And if I don't answer, don't take it personally, but don't give up either. And in the meantime, help me connect with other safe people. If I don't know you care, if you don't show you're interested, someone else might.